Hey Ultrawide fans, we have a monster of a GPU to review today. The RTX 4090 is bursting with excess power, making resolutions like 1080p completely CPU bound, and even standard 1440p resolution is underutilizing the beastly RTX 4090. But does that still hold true for 3440 by 1440? Or does the ultra-wide resolutions have enough pixels to saturate the monstrous RTX 4090? Well, let's jump into those raster benchmarks and find out. Starting off, we have Cyberpunk 2077, the can it play crisis of our time, played on its ultra preset with FSR turned off. At 3440 by 1440p, you can see high refresh rates of 114 FPS, but a surprisingly low 1% low that is 34% lower than the card's average. Moving to 3840 by 1600, we still see high refresh rates of 97 FPS, with some slightly better 1% lows, falling only 31% behind the raster average. And at 5120 by 1440, we are now in smooth range with an 85 FPS average, and the 1% lows continue to tighten up, now only 26% behind the raster average. And at the final resolution of 5120 by 2160, we're just hanging on to smooth gameplay with a 60 FPS average, and we are seeing some good 1% lows that are only 20% behind the raster average. We finally see a card that can deliver 60 plus FPS averages at all of our resolutions. It even keeps the 1% lows of our 3 lower resolutions above 60, and even the 4K Ultrawide is still an acceptable range. This is all before any DLSS is applied, making for a very satisfying result. Next up is the venerable Shadow of the Tomb Raider, played on its highest preset. Right out of the gate, we see monstrous 200 FPS with a 3440 by 1440p resolution, though its 1% low seems to be bumping up against the CPU limit, as it is actually lower than the 3840 by 1600 results. Speaking of which, we see a 183 FPS average for, and a very respectable 22% lower 1% low. And the high frame rates keep on coming at our 5120 by 1440 super ultra-wide resolution, coming in at 165 FPS with even tighter 1% lows. And even on our resolution monster, that is our 5120 by 2160 ultra-wide monitor, we are still seeing very high refresh rates of 124 FPS with some very tight 1% lows that are only 14% behind the raster results. Here we see complete domination of this title by the RTX 4090, with some of its performance being left on the table at 3440 by 1440. Maybe you could claw that back with a brand new 7800X 3D, but I'm willing to say that the 4090 is providing excessive performance at that resolution. Next up for our racing fans, we have Forza Horizon 5, played at its extreme preset. At our 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see a very nice 141 FPS. And again, we see some 1% low stagnation at this resolution, though it is a minor hit due to the small increments between resolutions. At 3840 by 1600, we see a barely lower 134 FPS average, and a 1% low, now only 20% slower than the average. At 5120 by 1440 super ultra-wide resolution, we are still in very high refresh rates at 128 FPS, while maintaining an equally tight 1% low. And lastly, our 5120 by 2160 ultra-wide resolution, we see high refresh rates of 116 FPS, with very tight 1% lows, only 14% lower than the raster average. While Forza might not be showing off the crazy high frame rates like some other games, it is getting some of the most consistent frame rates, making for a superbly smooth experience. Our next game is the 2023 action RPG Forspoken, played on its ultra preset with RT disabled. We are already seeing a 14% performance improvement from when I first tested this game at launch. At the 3440 by 1440p ultra-wide resolution, the RTX 4090 is getting high refresh rates of 108 FPS, with a 1% low of 27% below the raster average. Moving to 3840 by 1600p resolution, we are still in high refresh rates, with a 98 FPS average and a 1% low at a slightly tighter 24% behind the average. For our super ultra-wide 5120 by 1440 resolution, we are getting a smooth 86 FPS with 1% lows, a little bit higher at 26% below the average. And for the final resolution of 5120 by 2160, we are seeing a smooth 68 FPS average with a very respectable 1% low, only 19% slower than the average. Forspoken is another game that manages to use up all the 4090's available performance at 3440 by 1440 while still getting an enjoyable smooth gameplay experience at 5120 by 2160. A satisfying performance result that should leave plenty of room for DLSS to kick things up a notch if you want it to. Next we have Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, played at its Ultra preset. At 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see that the 4090 has run into a wall just before 200 FPS, leaving the RTX 4090 underutilized at this resolution for raster rendering, with 1% lows 30% behind the raster average. While fine for this frame rate, it's less than ideal. At 3840 by 1600 resolution, we are still hitting the limit at 199 FPS, with 1% lows 28% lower than raster average. At 5120 by 1440 Super Ultrawide resolution, we are finally off of the FPS limit with 178 FPS, with 1% low still 28% lower than the average. And lastly, at 5120 by 2160 Ultrawide resolution, we see the 4090 still providing very high refresh rates of 142 FPS, and with a tighter 1% low, now only 23% behind the raster average. Guardians of the Galaxy runs extremely fast in the RTX 4090 and ends up completely hitting walls at 3440 by 1440 and probably even losing some FPS at 3840 by 1600, which if you're not an FPS freak is practically begging you to turn on the ray tracing settings so you can get the most out of your monster GPU. Next we have our stealth action game Assassin's Creed Valhalla played on its ultra high preset. At 3440 by 1440p resolution, the 4090 is getting very high refresh rates of 137 FPS, and as is typical for this game, less than stellar 1% lows of 37% below the raster average. Moving to 3840 by 1600 resolution, we see very high refresh rates with 123 FPS average, with a 1% low 35% behind the average. At the 5120 by 1440 Super Ultrawide resolution, the frame rate drops into high refresh rate territory at 109 FPS, while still getting 35% slower 1% lows. And finally, at 5120 by 2160 Ultrawide resolution, we see smooth refresh rates of 88 FPS, with a 30% slower 1% low that still manages to stay above 60. While the RTX 4090 is not blowing the doors off with frame rate in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we are still seeing two of our resolutions over 120 FPS, and no 1% low dip below 60. With the game adopting DLSS and FSR later in life, you still have those options available to you to increase performance at our two higher resolutions. Next we have the Robo Dino Romp Horizon Zero Dawn, played on its ultimate preset. At 3440 by 1440p ultra-wide resolution, we see a very nice 173 FPS average, with the worst 1% lows in the whole test suite of 42% below the average, thanks to the 1% low stagnation, likely due to the 4090 being bottlenecked at this resolution. At the 3840 by 1600 resolution, we only see slightly lower 161 FPS for the average, and better but still subpar 1% low of 36% slower than the average. At 5120 by 1440 Super Ultrawide resolution, we are still at a very high refresh rate of 133 FPS, but the 1% low is still disappointing at 35% behind the average. At 5120 by 2160 Ultrawide resolution, we are still seeing a high refresh rate of 110 FPS. And finally, we are seeing a good 1% low, only 20% behind the average, making it actually faster than our Super Ultrawide resolution. Horizon Zero Dawn provides good enough performance at every resolution that you won't be reaching for DLSS. Not that that would do you any good at our lower resolutions, as the 4090 is already becoming limited at 3440 by 1440, flatlining the 1% lows and providing a lower average than one would expect from an unbound scenario. Next we have our wacky and wild Borderlands 3 played on its badass preset. At 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see very high refresh rates of 158 FPS and a nice 1% low, 20% slower than the average. Moving to 3840 by 1600 resolution, the 4090 is still delivering 140 FPS and an even better 1% low, only 17% lower than the average. At 5120 by 1440 Super Ultrawide resolution, it manages to stay in very high refresh rates with 121 FPS and another solid 1% low, 18% lower than the average. And lastly, 5120 by 2160 Ultrawide resolution, we see high refresh rates of 92 FPS with an even tighter 1% low, only 14% behind the average. With the RTX 4090 providing very strong average FPS and some of our tightest 1% lows, it's providing an experience that is so good you don't care that this game doesn't support DLSS or FSR. Next we have a game for our strategy buffs, Total War Warhammer III played on its Ultra preset using battle simulation. At 3440 by 1440p ultrawide resolution, we see very high refresh rates of 128 FPS and extremely tight 1% lows, only 12% lower than the average. and stepping up to our 3840 by 1600 resolution, we are now into high refresh rates with 112 FPS average, and more stunning 1% lows at only 11% slower than the average. At 5120 by 1440 Super Ultrawide resolution, the 4090 is still hanging on to high refresh rates with a 98 FPS average, with even more stunning 1% lows, only 9% below the average. And at our highest ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see smooth refresh rates of 75 FPS and another great 1% low showing, only 11% below the average. Total War Warhammer 3 has the best 1% lows of any game in the test suite, and with no 1% low dipping below 60, you are guaranteed a silky smooth play experience at every resolution. And for our last game, we have one for our online shooter fans. We have Rainbow Six Extraction played on its Ultra preset, with resolution quality set to fixed 100%. At 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see the RTX 4090 achieve speeds beyond what even the latest and greatest ultrawide monitors can achieve, with an extreme refresh rate of 268 FPS, while also maintaining a respectable 1% lows, only 22% behind the average. At 3840 by 1600 resolution, we are still seeing staggering refresh rates of 235 FPS, and a still solid 1% low, only 24% below the average. Moving up to 5120 by 1440 Super Ultrawide resolution, the 4090 is still hanging on to 200 FPS with that 206 FPS average, and a 1% low, only 23% lower than average. And finally, at our highest ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see the 4090 still keep things over 120 FPS, at 151 FPS average, delivering superb performance for this resolution, and a satisfactory 1% low of 26% below the raster average. With nearly all games getting over 120 FPS for their 1% lows, the 4090 is completely dominant in Rainbow Six Extraction. Now let's round everything up and see where the RTX 4090's performance lies. Looking at our 3440 by 1440p ultrawide performance, we see the RTX 4090 is in the upper end of very high refresh rates, but with a bit of a disappointing 1% low, 28% slower than the average, in part thanks to the 4090 being bottlenecked at this resolution by CPU, game engine, or otherwise. Taking a look at the per game results, we see one game with extreme refresh rates, 2 with super high refresh rates, 5 with very high refresh rates, and 2 with high refresh rates. And when we peek at the 1% lows, we see all games stay fair bit above 60 FPS. You would think with such a stellar performance that the RTX 4090 would get nothing but the strongest recommendation at this resolution, but this is actually where I recommend it the least, as you're leaving GPU performance on the table with this card. And there are two alternatives for a lot less money that can still monster this resolution. The RTX 4090 is still recommended. You're not throwing money in the trash like you would be at a 1080p resolution, but I would strongly recommend you look at a more balanced solution. Moving up to our 3840 by 1600p ultrawide resolution, the RTX 4090 is delivering very high refresh rate averages of 148 FPS, with a more standard 1% low, 25% behind the average. At this resolution, the 4090 seems to now avoid most of the bottlenecking. Looking at the per game results, we see 3 games with super high refresh rates, 4 with very high refresh rates, and 3 with high refresh rates. And when looking at the 1% lows, we again see all games deliver over 60 FPS. Again, at this resolution, I would still recommend getting an RTX 4080 or an RX 7900 XTX before recommending the RTX 4090, but at least here you're nearly leveraging its full power in almost all of the titles. Next up is our super ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 1440p. We are still getting a very high refresh rate average with 131 FPS, and a 1% low, only 24% behind the average. When looking at the per game results, we see 1 game still in super high refresh rate, 5 games with very high refresh rate, 2 games with high refresh rate, and 2 games with smooth refresh rate. And when we look at the 1% lows, we are still seeing every game stay above 60, which is fantastic for this resolution. This is the first resolution where I can recommend the RTX 4090 without equivocation. Wanting a card that can keep 1% lows above 60 without needing upscaling is a reasonable ask, and this is the first card that can actually do it at this resolution. And at our final ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 2160, the RTX 4090's average performance drops into high refresh rate range with 103 FPS average, but with a very respectable 1% low, only 20% behind the average. When looking at the per game results, we see 3 games with very high refresh rate, 3 with high refresh rates, 4 with smooth refresh rates, And when looking at the 1% lows, we see 8 out of the 10 games over 60 FPS, while 2 are hanging out in acceptable range. At 5120 by 2160, it's the first resolution where the 4090 is flat out the most recommended card. It is the first one to average 60 FPS or better in all games, though even it cannot do the same for the 1% lows. These are some very impressive results and should make anyone playing at this resolution very happy. Before we get into the conclusion, I just want to say if you enjoy Ultrawide content, please subscribe to this channel. We're getting close to our 1,000 subscriber milestone, which will allow this channel to get one step closer to being monetized, which will make it easier for me to afford more hardware and software to test on this channel. I'll keep making the videos as long as you keep watching them. Now let's see if the RTX 4090 is too much or just right for your Ultrawide resolution. It's no surprise that the RTX 4090 is monstrously fast, with it becoming the first card to get a strong recommendation at our 5120 by 2160 Ultrawide resolution, achieving over 60 FPS in all of our games. All this power does not mean that the RTX 4090 is an instant buy even if you can afford its hefty price tag. While our Ultrawide 3440 by 1440p resolution isn't as frequently CPU bound as its 16 by 9 counterpart, we still see a handful of games that have stagnant 1% lows or even negative scaling. And Guardians of the Galaxy is completely CPU bound at this resolution. If you're playing at a 3440 by 1440p Ultrawide resolution, I would strongly recommend a 1-tier down GPU. They can hit nearly 100 FPS in all the games at this resolution, while still leaving you with all the upscaling and frame generation tricks available. And they'll save you a boatload of cash. Even at 3840 by 1600p Ultrawide resolution, I still think the RX 7900 XTX or the RTX 4080 is the smarter buy. The super Ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 1440 is where the RTX 4090 can really stretch its legs and justify its purchase, making it a more of a if you can afford it, why not situation. And finally, at 5120 by 2160, this is where the RTX 4090 becomes a clear top recommendation. This is where its raw GPU grunt and its large memory pool become essential. As far as pricing is concerned, the RTX 4090's $1,600 MSRP is no deal by any stretch of the imagination. But online pricing is all over the place. Only Zotac is offering a card at MSRP, with a few others offering cards at $50 to $100 above MSRP. But the bulk of choices are in the $2,000 range. And some cards go up to the insane heights of $3,500, over double the MSRP. If you're not trying to break a world record, just buy the cheapest card that you can find with an aesthetic that you can live with. My MSRP Zotac RTX 4090 runs cool and quiet, with temperatures often in the high 50s on lighter titles and in the 60s on some heavier ones. All GPUs were tested on my test system featuring an AMD R7 5800X 3D CPU with 32GB of 3200Hz CL14 memory, running Windows 11 and using the latest Nvidia and AMD drivers. If you're looking to purchase an RTX 4090, or maybe you've decided you only need a 4080 or a 7900 XTX, I've included links in the description below to the cheapest ones I could find. Using those links really helped this channel out and allow me to afford the next GPU or game to test for you. Also, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want to check out the RTX 4080 or 7900 XTX, you can check them out in these videos here. Thank you for watching and have a great day.